In August 1965, the Beatles were performing to 45,000 screaming fans at Shea Stadium when John Lennon suddenly stopped mid-song, signalled the entire band to halt, and walked to the edge of the stage, leaving 45,000 people in complete stunned silence. What happened next with a dying 5-year-old boy in the front row became the most emotional moment in rock history, captured on film but never fully explained. But what did John whisper to that child that was so powerful it moved an entire stadium to tears? And why did the Beatles risk everything to break protocol for one small boy? The summer heat of August 15th, 1965 pressed down on Shea Stadium like a heavy blanket. But inside the concrete bowl the air crackled with something electric. 45,000 voices merged into a single deafening roar that could be heard miles away in Queens. The Beatles emerged from the tunnel, 4 silhouettes against the blinding stage lights, and the sound that erupted wasn't quite human anymore. It was primal, volcanic, a release of pure teenage energy that had been building for months. John Lennon adjusted his Rickenbacker guitar, peering through the glare at what resembled an ocean of outstretched arms and tear-streaked faces. The crowd swayed like wheat in a storm, but movement caught his eye in the front section. A cluster of security guards had formed near the stage barrier, their usual stoic expressions replaced by something that looked almost like panic. They were bent over, speaking urgently into their radios, their movements sharp and purposeful against the chaotic backdrop of Beatlemania. Paul counted them in, and they launched into twist and shout, but even with the massive speaker system, their voices were swallowed by the screaming. This was normal. They'd grown accustomed to performing music that no one could actually hear, but tonight felt different. John's eyes kept drifting back to that commotion in the front row, where the security guards were now joined by what appeared to be medical personnel. The stage lights created a wall between performer and audience, but John had developed an instinct for reading the energy of a crowd. He could sense when someone fainted, when fights broke out, when the collective mood shifted from euphoria to something darker. Right now, the energy had shifted dramatically. A thin, almost desperate quality had crept into the screaming, and in the front section, he could make out figures huddled together in a way that suggested crisis rather than celebration. George Harrison noticed it too, glancing over at John with raised eyebrows as they moved into She Loves You. The security guards were no longer trying to be subtle. One of them was waving frantically at the stage, pointing down at a disturbance John couldn't quite see through the maze of bodies and banners. The crowd continued to surge and scream, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in their midst, but the band members had learned to multitask, to perform while simultaneously monitoring their environment for signs of trouble. As they finished the song, John caught a glimpse of what had captured the security team's attention. In the front row, pressed against the barrier, was a small figure that didn't belong in this sea of teenagers. A child, maybe 5 years old, held in the arms of adults who looked nothing like the screaming fans surrounding them. Even from the stage, John could see that something was terribly wrong with the boy. His stillness was unnatural, his pallor visible even under the harsh lights. The parents' faces were etched with a desperation that cut through all the manufactured hysteria like a knife through silk. This moment of recognition had been building all evening, rooted in what had happened 3 hours earlier backstage in the cramped concrete corridors beneath Shea Stadium. The Beatles sat in folding chairs that had seen better decades. The dressing room smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes, a far cry from the glamour their fans imagined. John Lennon held an ice pack against his temples, the beginning of another migraine creeping in like fog. The headaches had become a constant companion on this tour, a physical manifestation of the pressure that never seemed to lift. Paul McCartney paced the small space, his usual optimism strained thin. They'd been on the road for 8 months straight, moving from city to city like pieces on a chessboard, always one step ahead of the chaos that followed them everywhere. His fingers moved unconsciously along the neck of his bass, running through chord progressions that had become as automatic as breathing. The music was still there, still pure, but everything around it had become a machine that demanded constant feeding. George Harrison sat in the corner, his eyes closed, trying to find a moment of peace in the hurricane. At 22, he was the youngest, but fame's pressure had aged him in ways that couldn't be measured in years. The screaming that awaited them outside had stopped being about the music months ago. It was about a different hunger now, a hunger that 4 young men from Liverpool couldn't possibly satisfy, no matter how many stages they conquered or records they sold. Ringo Starr methodically worked his way through a plate of sandwiches, the only one who still ate regularly on tour. Food had become just fuel, sleep a luxury they couldn't afford, and privacy a memory from another life. His drum kit waited on the stage above them, set up on the pitcher's mound of a baseball stadium because that was the only way to fit everyone in. They were playing baseball stadiums now, spaces designed for crowds to watch a game, not hear music. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The real burden wasn't the fame itself. It was the distance it created between who they were and who everyone needed them to be. John had always been the most introspective of the four, the one who questioned everything, including their own success. Lately he'd been wondering if they were still musicians or if they'd become products entirely, symbols, objects, brands in expensive suits. When had they stopped being four friends making music and become the Beatles, a brand that existed separate from the people who'd created it? The sound of the crowd filtering down through the concrete reminded them that 45,000 people were waiting, people who had paid money and travelled distances and built up expectations that felt impossible to meet. Each fan saw something different in them. Rebellion, romance, escape, hope. How could four human beings carry the dreams of so many without losing themselves in the process? The pressure to be constantly on, to maintain the image of four cheeky lads having the time of their lives, had become exhausting. Brian Epstein knocked on the door, his usual 5-minute warning delivered with the precision of a military operation. In 5 minutes, they would transform from four tired young men into the Beatles, stepping through that tunnel into a wall of sound and light that would strip away everything human about them. But tonight, as they stood and picked up their instruments, the air felt charged with possibility. Maybe it was the venue, maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was just time for something real to break through the carefully constructed facade. Back on stage, the opening chords of Help rang out across Shea Stadium, but that nagging feeling from earlier now consumed John's attention. The commotion in the front row had intensified, and now he could see clearly what had been troubling him all evening. A small boy, no more than 5 years old, lay limp in his father's arms while his mother clutched at the security barrier with white knuckles. The child's skin had a translucent quality that John recognised from visiting his own sick relatives, the look of someone whose body was giving up the fight. The parents weren't screaming like the other fans. They weren't reaching for autographs or trying to climb the barrier. They were simply there, holding their dying son, and their stillness cut through the chaos more effectively than any amount of noise could have. The father's lips were moving, and John realised he was speaking to the boy, probably trying to keep him conscious, trying to give him something to hold on to in what might be his final moments. Without thinking, John's fingers stopped moving on the guitar strings. The chord hung in the air, unresolved, as he stepped away from his microphone. Paul noticed first, his bass line faltering as he turned to see what had captured John's attention. George's lead guitar continued for a few more measures before he too realised the shift had occurred. Ringo's drums were the last to fade, leaving only the sound of 45,000 voices slowly becoming aware that the music had stopped. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It spread through the stadium like ripples on water. The screaming nearest the stage died first as fans noticed the band members standing motionless, no longer performing. Then, section by section, the crowd began to quiet, confused whispers replacing the earlier hysteria. Within 30 seconds, Shea Stadium had fallen into something approaching complete silence, a phenomenon that no one present had ever experienced. John could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he looked down at the small family in the front row. The boy's eyes were open but unfocused, and his breathing was visible even from the stage, shallow, laboured, the kind that speaks of borrowed time. The father looked up and made eye contact with John across the divide between performer and audience, and in that moment, understanding passed between them that had nothing to do with fame or music or any of the machinery that had brought them all to this place. Security guards had stopped their frantic radio chatter and were looking up at the stage, waiting for some signal about what to do next. The medical personnel who had arrived were standing by helplessly. This wasn't a typical concert emergency they could simply remove from the venue. This was a family choosing to spend what might be their son's last conscious moments at a Beatles concert, and the weight of that choice hung over everyone who understood what was happening. Paul, George and Ringo moved closer to John, not speaking but forming a unit in the way they had learned to do instinctively over years of performing together. They could see what John saw now, and the same realization was written on all their faces. This wasn't about the show anymore. This wasn't about the 45,000 people who had paid to see them perform. This was about one small boy who was running out of time, and 4 young men who suddenly understood that they had the power to give him something precious in these final moments. 45,000 people remained suspended in unnatural quiet, everyone sensing that history was about to unfold, but no one quite understanding what. Even the most experienced security personnel had never dealt with anything like this, a moment where the entire machinery of a concert had simply stopped, leaving only human beings looking at each other across an impossible divide. John set his guitar down carefully on its stand, the small sound of metal against metal amplified in the stadium's silence. He walked to the front of the stage, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world instead of 45,000 people watching his every step. The security guards tensed, unsure whether to intervene. This wasn't in any protocol they'd ever learned. But John's quiet authority, something that had nothing to do with his celebrity, made them step aside. Paul, George and Ringo followed without discussion, abandoning their instruments and forming a line at the edge of the stage. The drop to the crowd barrier was only about 4 feet, but it might as well have been an ocean for all the times any of them had crossed it during a performance. John knelt down, bringing himself as close to eye level with the family as possible, and extended his hands toward the father holding the dying boy. The man looked up with eyes that held too much pain for one person to carry. His wife was crying silently, her hand resting on her son's forehead with the tenderness that only comes from knowing time is running out. The boy himself seemed to drift in and out of consciousness, but at the sight of John Lennon reaching down toward him, recognition flickered in his eyes. Recognition, wonder, maybe just the simple awareness that this moment was extraordinary. "What's his name?" John asked, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying in the perfect acoustics of the silence. "Tommy," the father whispered back. "Tommy loves your music. He made us bring him tonight." The sentence broke in the middle, the weight of what wasn't being said, that this might be Tommy's last night, hanging between them like a physical thing. John reached down further and the father carefully lifted Tommy up. The boy was heartbreakingly light, his small body seeming to barely disturb the air as John gathered him into his arms. Tommy's head fell against John's shoulder with the trust that only children possess, and for a moment, the most famous musician in the world became simply a young man holding someone else's child, while that child's parents watched through tears. "Hello, Tommy," John whispered, his Liverpool accent soft and warm. "We're going to play just for you tonight, all right?" Tommy's response was barely perceptible. Just a small movement that might have been a nod, but it was enough. John looked out at the stadium full of people who had paid to see a show, and instead were witnessing something far more precious. The moment when entertainment became human connection, when celebrity became simple kindness. Paul knelt beside John and gently touched Tommy's hand. "You're our special guest tonight," he said softly. George and Ringo moved closer, creating a circle around the boy that felt both protective and intimate. For several long minutes they simply stayed like that. 4 young men who had conquered the world finding a connection they'd forgotten existed through the trust of one small child. When John finally handed Tommy back to his father, the boy's eyes were brighter, more focused than they'd been all evening. The parents mouthed "thank you" over and over, but John shook his head. "Thank you," he said back, and somehow everyone in the front rows could hear him. "Thank you for bringing him to us." The Beatles returned to their instruments, but the entire dynamic had shifted. They played the rest of their set, but it was no longer a performance. It was a gift, offered to Tommy and received by everyone else who was lucky enough to be there. Years later, those who were present would struggle to explain what made that moment so powerful. It wasn't just the spectacle of seeing their heroes act with such spontaneous compassion. It was the reminder that beneath all the screaming and hysteria and manufactured emotion, music was still about connection, one human heart reaching toward another. And sometimes, when you're very lucky, you get to witness the exact moment when that connection saves someone's life, even if only for a little while.